When I started researching for this video, I thought that there were 7 continents with 7 pretty straightforward names. But I was wrong, in more ways than one. Let me take you on a voyage of discovery, charting some of the incredible stories behind the names of our continents. And at the end, you can decide which name has the strangest origin story. But first, a secret from the continent naming industry. No one can agree on how many continents there are. The word continent means large landmass, but there are no strict definitions on what counts as large, just historical conventions. How many continents were you taught that there were? Billions of people were taught that there are 6, or sometimes 5. Most people watching this will believe that there are 7 continents, but might there be 8? Or, if we include smaller continental masses called microcontinents, are there possibly 30? Wait, does this mean that the weirdest name for a continent is actually Madagascar? Madagascar is an island/microcontinent off mainland Africa, famous for its vanilla and its lemurs. But it was named by Marco Polo, who thought that Madagascar was actually Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. He also couldn't spell to save his life, leaving us with Madagascar. Or how about Zealandia, encompassing New Zealand and New Caledonia, hailed by some as the 8th official continent? That's just named after Zeeland, a coastal province in the Netherlands, with the epically imaginative etymology of sea plus land. Okay, those are some pretty strange names. But what about the main continents? What is their backstory? That's when things get really weird. In ascending order of strangeness, here is the story of our 7 most famous continents. We begin with Africa. Did you know that the continent was almost called Libya, and then Ethiopia? The particular word Africa was popularized by the Romans, who used the name Africa Terra, or Land of the Afri, to describe the vicinity of Carthage in what is modern-day Tunisia. They would go on to conquer this area, defeating Carthage in the Third and Final Punic War and setting up the province of Africa Proconsularis and firmly establishing the name. But the question remains, who were these Afri in the so-called Land of the Afri? Essentially, the Afri were an indigenous Berber tribe named by those nearby Carthaginians, either from the Phoenician word afar, meaning dust, or from the Berber Ifri, meaning cave. The Berbers are quite famous, after all, for their cave dwellings. Either way, the Roman appellation Africa began to be stretched to encompass a larger area as the Romans conquered nearby provinces such as Numidia and Tripolitania. Though the Romans would lose this land to the Vandals in the 400s, maps of the region were not permanently vandalized. During the Middle Ages, as Europeans realized just how gigantic the African continent was, they gradually extended the name of Africa southwards to cover more and more of the landmass. But there was competition from names such as Libya, a name found in 4,000-year-old hieroglyphics, and from Ethiopia, from the Greek for sunburnt face, over exactly what would become the name for the entire continent. By the end of the 17th century, though, the competition was over, quite probably due to a fusty preference for Latin-sounding names. This process of an obscure name stretching to encompass an entire continent is mirrored in the next strangest continental name, Asia. Herodotus, the Greek historian, uses the word Asia in the 5th century BCE to describe a small patch of territory on the east bank of the Aegean Sea. Does this word simply come from the Greek asis, meaning muddy, to describe the silty water of that coast? Or does it more likely go deeper to Asuwa, a grouping of states who dwelt in the area 1,000 years earlier, whose name may well stretch back to the ancient Akkadian root word Asu, meaning sunrise? We may never know for sure which story is correct, but it would not be the last time that Asia was known as the land of the rising sun. Whichever is the case, the Greeks were soon referring to the whole of Anatolia as Asia. Then, when the name outgrew even this area and stretched further east, the original Anatolian Asia became known as Asia Minor, the smaller Asia. The bigger Asia would eventually span almost 45 million square kilometers. But Asia isn't the only continent whose name might have truly ancient Mesopotamian roots. The Akkadians, yes, them again, have a word Erebu, which means sunset. Europe, from a Middle Eastern perspective, would have been in the direction of the setting sun. This does seem like a simple explanation for the name Europe, but perhaps no name origin is as heavily debated, however, with two other plausible theories put forward. Some scholars point to Greek, where Euris, meaning wide, combines with ops, meaning face or eye, to arrive at wide gazing. This derivation would hint at the awe with which Greek sailors viewed the giant, wide-ranging mountain ranges, sweeping steppes, and broad coastlines of Europe. The classic version, in contrast, of the name Europe tells of the goddess Europa, famously abducted by Zeus. Could it be that it was her eyes that were wide-gazing? This ambiguity over Europe's name contrasts with the known origin of our next continental name. Antarctica comes from the Greek Antarcticos, from anti, which means opposite, and Arcticos, Arctic, literally opposite to the Arctic. Okay, but where does the Arctic get its name? The word Arctic comes from the Greek word for bear, as the constellation of the Great Bear Ursa Major is visible only in the Northern Hemisphere. No, unfortunately, the name does not come, as I used to believe, and I think tell other people, from the fact that polar bears appear in the Arctic but not in Antarctica. That's a pity. That Antarctica, such a vast southern landmass, even existed had been speculated on for millennia. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote about an Antarctic region in around 350 BCE. The Greek geographer Marinus of Tyre is said to have used the name in his now lost world map from the 2nd century CE. They believed there had to be a vast Terra Australis, or southern land, in the south of the globe to balance the northern continents, as if Earth was some finely weighted seesaw. As you might have guessed by now, the Terra Australis name was instead taken up by our next continent, Australia, in the early 1800s. Having given up on finding this mythical Antarctica, British explorer Matthew Flinders was able to popularise the naming of Australia, giving his rationale that there was no probability of finding any significant landmass anywhere more south than Australia. The continent that would come to be known as Antarctica would be explored decades after Flinders' 1814 book on Australia, which he titled A Voyage to Terra Australis. By then, Australia had dibs on this illustrious title, and Antarctica had to make do with being opposite land, as we've seen. If only James Cook had succeeded in sighting Antarctica in his 1772 to 1775 voyages, Australia might, like its neighbour New Zealand, have kept its old name of New Holland. This tale of what might have been brings us to potentially the weirdest continent name of all. A name for not one, but two great landmasses, and a name that was, more than any other, arrived at through almost total happenstance. Of course, I speak of America. What place comes to your mind when I say America? Before we get into the craziest of all naming controversies, I should tell you that it is what is now called South America that was actually first called America. Then the name stretched, as continental names all seem to do, to both the northern and southern landmasses. Now, many people use America as a shorthand for just one country. But how did we end up with that name? Of course, for the great part of human history, the Americas had many names in many native languages. The human inhabited history of the New World goes back tens of thousands of years, with both continents gradually becoming populated by peoples crossing the Bering Strait from Central Asia. They had their own conceptions of their land, with Mashike Menisi in the Ojibwe Native American language, meaning Turtle Island, reflecting a widespread belief that all the land rested on the back of a gigantic turtle. What of outsiders? What did non-natives call this continent? Well, for the most part, nothing, as they did not include it on their maps. It only existed in legend and myth. Some people say an Irish monk, St. Brendan, landed in America in the early 6th century, and scholars have proven that such a voyage is at least technically possible. But to be honest, with talk of communions held on the back of whales, it is hard to separate fact from fiction. Then there were the Viking sightings of a land southwest of Greenland. Sagas telling of natives that they named Skraelings. But this was no myth. Firm evidence has been unearthed that the Vikings had settlements in North America at least as early as 1021. The Norsemen gave their settlement the name Vinland, Old Norse for wineland, or perhaps pastureland. The plausible grape-based etymology is retained in the 13th century Gronlendinga saga, linking it to the vinber or wine brew, a term for grapes or currants found in the new continent. This matches with the long-standing Scandinavian tradition of fermenting berries into wine. There were other rumoured Viking landings in North America, and other names, such as Markland and Helluland. Perhaps one day firm evidence will be found of these settlements too. Over time, however, things got colder for these intrepid Northmen. The Little Ice Age began in the 12th century and worsened badly by the 14th. This blocked sea routes to and from North America and Greenland and wiped out the settlement in Greenland. One can only imagine the last of the North American survivors huddling on in a domain that would before too long get a new name. But for this Little Ice Age, it might be Norse now spoken in a land called Vinland. Now we must talk of Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus. More specifically, about a Florentine businessman who supplied a ship to Columbus. That supplier's name was Amerigo Vespucci. He was in with the Medicis in Florence and loved buying expensive maps, but he was no accomplished seaman. His name entered legend not for what he did, but instead for what he realised. Amerigo Vespucci was a low-ranking officer, perhaps not much more than a passenger, on at least 2, and perhaps up to 4, visits to Brazil and the northeast coast of that southern continent, beginning sometime between 1497 and 1499. We can't be certain about the dates, because he became something of a celebrity, about which much was rumoured and written, and much less known for sure. What he figured out, or is said to have done, is that he had encountered a new world, mundus novus. He coined that expression to make clear that this was no part of Asia, no Indies, as Columbus thought. Soon though, Vespucci was the talk of the town, a legendary captain whose number of trips and their extent was embellished by the week. This almost Twitter trend would not have mattered much to history, but for the fact that Martin Waldseemüller was quite coincidentally finishing off a revised edition of Ptolemy's world map. He heard of these tales of Vespucci's exploits and named the continent in his honour. One of Waldseemüller's collaborators is said to have said, "I do not see what right anyone would have to object to calling this part, that is the South American mainland, after Americus, which is the Latinized version of America, who discovered it, and who is a man of intelligence, that is the land of Americus, or America. After all, both Europa and Asia got their names from women." As my attentive listeners may remember, that last fact may well be a further misunderstanding by the mapmakers, as it is not at all clear that Europe and Asia are named after women. But what is clear is that two continents are now named after one man, a social media celebrity, if you like, in the early 1500s. Occasionally, scholars do put forward other, much less convincing theories for the origin of the name America, but they don't rock the consensus view. So, is this the proof that the Americas are the most misnamed continent or continents of all? Well, I do wonder actually. After all, where does the name Amerigo come from? Linked to surnames such as Emery and first names such as Henry, Amerigo likely derives from the Gothic Amalric, meaning home ruler. Given the famous history on both continents of fighting to be ruled from home, to not be ruled by outsiders, might America not be the most appropriate continental name of all? Thank you very much for watching, and please do let me know what you think in the comments.